I built a giant stadium. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I promise to give you the freshest intelligence I can get from the front lines. Despite the difficulties, we ask that you stick with the film until the end and give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Now I'll show you the compilation I made just for you, detailing what went down in the most perilous part of the front and the tremendous victories our army gained. Zaporizhia and Donetsk are located on a strategic axis of attack in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As a result of the Ukrainian troops' unprecedented assault on the beleaguered lines of Velika Novosilka, sabotage's planned course had to be drastically altered. First and foremost, the city of Storage is currently the target of Ukrainian military offensive preparations meant to prolong the blowhole net surfing settlement after the liberation of Storage Paradise. After seizing control of Blahonet, the Ukrainians kept making progress in the city's southern sector. To the south of the metropolis is where you'll find the town of Makivka. The Russians have been completely driven out of this region of Ukraine by the Ukrainians. Next, Chechnya, a village between Velika Novosilka and the city of Storojeva, was one of the areas the Ukrainians were able to take control of. As a result of their offensive operations, Kiev's offensive plans began to split into various different paths. Once Ukrainian troops effectively retook all of these places to the west of an assault corridor running north to south, Ukrainian forces have recently shifted their attention. Suryanopil, Novo-Lavanir and Prionia are just a few of the several towns that make up this assault route. These communities can be found all the way to the front lines of Velika, Novosilka and Staromansky Eroginia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has stated that his country's armed forces have made substantial gains in this area. Ukrainian forces were able to successfully plant blue and yellow flags in Novotorika and Lavana, as promised in earlier proclamations. International intelligence sources and major media outlets have both confirmed the Ukrainian forces' impressive gains. To what extent had the Ukrainians advanced between Prussia and Donetsk on these crucial front lines? Hanna Maliar, Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Defense, addressed this issue when her country's military conquered domains like Tora, Jibloho, Net, Muscatine and Makivka and Levin and Nevada saw their first glimpse of the first legs of the ocean. Rivka Hanna Maliar started off by sincerely praising the accomplishments of her troops. Immediately thereafter, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Maliar announced that in addition to these 6 towns, his forces had also taken control of Lukova. According to Hanna Maliar, the Ukrainian armed forces were able to move 6.5 kilometers in the Zaporozhye-Donetsk steppes as a result of this and seize control of a 90 square kilometer territory. Only a small percentage of the 40,000 mi under Russian control were retaken, despite the fact that 7 settlements were seized in the course of just 1 week. Malaya did not disclose any additional details regarding the specific time frame of the assault operations. Attacks on specific communities can be pieced together in time and location by following the Ukrainian army's attack roads. Moscow has not yet made any public recognition of the successes of the Ukrainian government. The Russian Ministry of Defense has stated on numerous occasions that it effectively thwarts invasion efforts in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. At the same time, well-known Russian military bloggers were drawing attention to the fact that Ukrainian forces had captured Joanet, Muscatine, and Makarovka and were moving southward. The Russian ministry reported the destruction of 8 Ukrainian drones and an ammunition cache in eastern Ukraine, but the battle was actually taking place closer to the Zaporizhia Oblast. To rephrase, Russia's defense ministry was trying to divert attention away from the region below and onto the progress the Ukrainian army was making in Zaporizhia. Additionally, the Russians are presently attempting to hinder the movement of Ukrainian forces from the Zaporizhia region to the wider limits. A senior officer who acts as a spokesperson for the Ukrainian military has claimed that extraordinary steps were taken by the Russians to achieve this goal. It has been speculated that Russia planted an explosive device near Ukrainian troops in Roulette to impede their advance southward. However, you should know that this is a very risky thing to do. Destroying a dam on the considerably larger Dnipro River a week ago has already led to a humanitarian crisis in some parts of the south. A large number of Russian trench lines were flooded after the Kakhovka Dam collapsed, both in this area and in the neighboring Kherson region. Even when Russian forces blow up the dam at Roulette, the Ukrainians will continue to push forward anyway. The Russians would be putting themselves in harm's way if they blew up this dam, and it might lead Kiev to change the focus of their attack preparations. This is because Russian forces are still present in the 6 towns that the Ukrainians seized after destroying the dam at Mukriani. Russian insurgents hiding out in the Zapatosa village captured by the Ukrainians were put in danger. The breach of the dam and the subsequent flooding may have wiped out Russian forces that had gathered here to defend against Ukrainian attacks. As the flood disaster in Kherson Oblast continues to have lasting effects, these Russian forces have nowhere to go. Ukrainian partisan organizations have built up tremendous pressure in Melitopol, Tokmak, and the Kherson Triangle. That is to say, it appears that the Russian resistance organizations will not be able to prevent the fallout from the destruction of the Roulette Dam. However, the Russians have been employing this tactic since the outbreak of hostilities. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered his armed forces and defense minister to do everything possible to stop the advance of Ukrainian forces, including risking the lives of Russian soldiers if necessary. This has led some to liken the steps taken by the Moscow leadership to a game of Russian roulette. You must be willing to knowingly give up some of your own guys in order to achieve victory. Ukraine's side of the fight has a different operating mechanism. Victory or defeat on the battlefield sometimes comes down to whether or not one's troops believe in ideals like patriotism and volunteerism in the army led by Zelensky. Considering the West spends tens of billions of dollars annually providing Ukraine with weapons, training, and intelligence, the outcome is hardly shocking. The Ukrainian people are aware that they may need to make significant progress over the summer in order to maintain the same level of military, financial, and political support from the West. In addition to their own battlefield determination, tactics, and motivation to drive a Russian from their territory, especially after decisive progress in the Zaporizhia region. If it does, maybe it can rebuild after Moscow's damage and loss of population. No matter what happens, the West will keep backing Ukraine's struggle against Russian occupation, including the Weimar Triangle, as it is commonly referred to. The leaders of France, Germany, and Poland met in Paris recently to discuss Ukraine and other issues. According to comments made by French President Emmanuel Macron during the same meeting, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said yes when asked if Germany had agreed at the NATO summit in July that Ukraine should be offered security guarantees. At the press conference, he confirmed the start of the counter-offensive with Zelensky, with whom he had recently spoken. Macron further pledged that Ukraine, like France and Germany, would always have assistance. Poland has given its blessing to the happenings in Ukraine in a variety of different ways. Poland is already well known as one of the countries that gives Ukraine the greatest aid. The commitment of the virtual government to maintaining its support for Kiev was a crucial sign. One of the most crucial considerations was this. However, some Western military analysts have claimed that it is still too early to draw conclusions and that the conflicts that have occurred so far may indicate that Ukraine is still testing the Russian defenses, despite the strong alliance being emphasized during the discussion at the meeting. They feel that it is premature to make any definitive statements at this time. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has commented on the situation, saying that it is too early to tell where Ukraine's counterattack will go. Blinken, though, assured the press that Washington is certain Kiev will keep up its impressive performance. Many experts in the field of military strategy and tactics agreed that freeing the Crimean Peninsula should be at the forefront of Kiev's offensive plans. Some have speculated that following the conflict in Zaporizhia, Bakhmut will once again become an active region. To argue in favor of this idea is not unreasonable, given that the Ukrainian operations are also aimed at capturing control of the firm fronts. It is actually too early to proclaim anything at this point in time yet. This is the situation. As a result, in the coming days, we will all take a close look at how far the Ukrainians can go in maintaining their impressive improvement. Leaving a comment below the video to discuss the issue would be very appreciated. Russia and Ukraine's degree of enmity toward one another is rising steadily. In addition to the ongoing fighting in the seized territories, reports of explosions and flames on Russian territory have also surfaced. The Ukrainian authorities have previously signaled their willingness to retaliate in the not-too-distant past. They called it the Spring Operation, even although the formal start of the Spring Operation has not been proclaimed as of yet. The recent series of events seems to portend the start of the operation. In addition to its own armed forces, those who disagree with Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine often argued that the Ukrainian armed forces are actually fighting for the freedom and independence of both their own country and Russia. Notable examples are the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Legion for the Freedom of Russia. Despite not being official military units, these organizations coordinate efforts with the Ukrainian armed forces. The Legion of Freedom of Russia and the Russian Volunteer Corps have shifted their focus from occupied territory in Ukraine to key location within Russia itself. There has been an increase in attacks by anti-occupation groups in recent weeks. Areas in the Belgrade region, which straddles the border between Russia and Ukraine, are receiving special attention. There is a lot of concern in the Kremlin because of the constant attacks. In contrast, anti-occupation groups have promised to maintain their resistance until the war ends. Gladkov claims that Belgorod Governor Vojislav Gladkov announced a new attack on the Belgorod region via message on his Telegram account the day before a fire broke out at a power plant in the Belgorod area. After explosive material was dropped from a drone inside the building, rapidly consuming a large area, the fire spread rapidly. The Kremlin is growing increasingly concerned about Belgrade as a result of this most recent event. Occupying Russians are in continual fear for their lives. What happened in Belgrade deserves a closer examination. Therefore, let's do just that. Click the super thanks button below to show your appreciation for our channel and staff members. The anti-occupation forces led by the Russians are making great strides in Belgrade. The violence that has been occurring for the past few weeks is at its height right now. Following the Belgorod explosion, the Russian Freedom Legion and the Russian Volunteer Chorus made an official proclamation that the settlement of Kasenko had been completely liberated. Both groups say they want to see Russia become independent of Putinism. There are also rumors that it invaded Reverin and smashed the gear the Russian occupiers of Chubenko had stored there. This action was announced on the Legion of Freedom of Russia's social media account, which you can read about below. We were able to destroy a self-propelled mortar, A2X4 Tolpin and Kamaz with the ammunition they brought. Millions of people saw photos and videos of the unrest in the Belgrade area as they circulated online. Social media accounts associated with anti-occupation groups and others publish graphic images of explosions, flames, and violent battles in the region. The Russian occupiers ignored all that was happening and pretended nothing had happened. Boguslav Gladkov, governor of Belgrade, claims that the area's territory is free of any hostile forces. While the Russian occupiers did their best to hide their losses, the truth eventually emerged. In addition to Belgrado, the Legion of Freedom of Russia had targeted the nearby village of Novi Olshanka. The Legion entered the city with a tricolor white, blue, and white flag. The Legion of the Freedom of Russia announced on its social media account that its members had relocated to the Novi Tavaskan neighborhood in the Belgorod Oblast region, flying a flag they called the Free Russia flag. The next picture shows our tank flying the flag of Free Russia in the nearby town of Novi Rozanka, not far from Savenko. From our country to yours. Good morning. and I hope you continue to fight for what you believe in. Moreover, the Legion broadcast a video in which they vowed to keep fighting until the Russian occupation was finished. A member of the Legion makes a similar claim in the video. Freedom is coming to Russia. Freedom requires personal sacrifice. It's clear that the Russian factions fighting the occupation are committed to toppling Putin's government. The most recent attack by anti-occupation groups in Belgrade targeted the Russian occupiers' energy facility. These groups have carried out attacks against power plants, fuel storage facilities, and oil and gas pipelines. There's little question that this is being done to starve Russia's economy of its lifeblood. Western and European sanctions have hampered the Russian invaders. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, gives little thought to the issue because he relies on the country's natural gas and oil. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army and Russian anti-occupation forces coordinated their efforts to strike Putin's financial backers. As a result of this strategic choice, Putin had to give up hundreds of miles of oil and gas pipelines. The Russian president is currently facing a number of unexpected challenges. Anti-occupation groups requested a meeting with regional authorities the day before they assaulted the Belgrade energy station on camera. The group's leaders detailed for the governor exactly why and where they sought a meeting with him. The time has arrived for me to speak with Mr. Gladkov, governor of the troubled Belgorod region. We are willing to hand these inmates over to you as a gesture of goodwill due to the frequency with which this issue has been raised by the Russian Federation's administration. I appreciate the chance to speak with you, regular Russian soldiers, about the current situation in the region. In light of this, we'd like to offer an invitation to you to join us for a discussion within the sacred halls of the Novotel Lanka Temple. Please have someone who is not armed. Accompany the driver. I'll be there in person with a prisoner representative to congratulate you on receiving the Order of Courage for your brave actions on behalf of the LSR and other inmates. In addition, I will have a witness accompany me. Since the abducted Russian soldiers are still alive, Governor Gladkov agreed to meet with the Legion of Freedom of Russia between 5 o'clock and 6 p.m. for an interview. However, no such meeting has taken place as of yet. According to conflict experts, the attack on the energy complex would never have happened under alternate circumstances where the meeting may have taken place. According to The Sun, the attack was an act of defiance against the Russian occupiers. The message got across clearly. It is critical that you respond to the request for dialogue and stop the occupation immediately. Since Russia's takeover of Ukraine began, Vladimir Putin, the country's leader, has been losing support at home and abroad. Russia has lost more than just soldiers and weapons on the front lines. Russia has been hit with more sanctions than any other country since the commencement of the invasion of Ukraine. Western and European countries have placed sanctions on the Russian government and several Russian businesses and individuals who agreed with Vladimir Putin that an attack on Ukraine was warranted. Russia's economy has suffered greatly as a result of the sanctions. In Russia, the cost of living is rising at an alarming rate. In addition to these problems, Putin is in a precarious situation right now because of attacks by Russian anti-occupation organizations. In order to do the most damage to the Russian occupiers, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Free Russia Legion focused their operations in certain areas. Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, is at a loss as to how to respond to these assaults. Putin's end will be ignominious, considering the actions of the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Free Russia Legion. What do you make of their attacks? What effect, if any, will these attacks have on the war's overall trajectory? Russian President Vladimir Putin has suffered defeats on the battlefield and in the polls. Can he recover? How successful are the anti-occupation groups at seizing all of Belgrade? How do you think the battle will end up playing out in your professional opinion? Please share your thoughts with us. We value your input. I built a giant stadium. Despite the difficulties, as a native Ukrainian, I will bring you up-to-date information straight from the front lines. We have gathered here today to show you what happened in the most heated sectors of the front, as well as the magnificent victories that our army accomplished. Again, we aim for Crimea. Ukraine is finally making substantial strides toward accomplishing its long-term goals. This development started during the big conflict that freed Crimea. The Kremlin's ability to protect Crimea's essential infrastructure is called into question by any new activity there. Russia is trying to improve the Crimean defense line, in part because of the psychological and logistical support the peninsula provides for its conflict in Ukraine. Because Crimea still performs this function, this is the case. Russia is trying to create powerful defenses, particularly on the peninsula of Crimea, while Ukrainian authorities have threatened to recover all of Ukraine's land that Russia now holds. It was occupied unlawfully in 2014 and is now a strategic node for both sides. The defensive lines are making an effort, it seems, to speed up the offensive that Ukraine has begun. Crimea has witnessed the development of a new offensive force in line with the plan to attack Ukraine. As a result of the Ukrainian government's offensive, widespread support in the West has been amassing. Russia is increasing the intensity of its patrols in the Crimea. A number of strikes are still being conducted against key supply centers and trains that are essential to Russian forces in Crimea, where Russian President Vladimir Putin is stationed in the hopes that Ukraine might be able to win it back with a surprise attack. The attacks are an attempt to break the physical link between Russia and the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine views the Crimean Peninsula as strategically vital. We may argue that Putin and other high-ranking military officials felt enough pressure as a result of these attacks that they changed course. Russian President Vladimir Putin always seemed to start his day with a bang. There was a massive explosion on a railroad line that connected Russian occupiers on the Ukrainian mainland with their counterparts on the occupied Crimean Peninsula. Crimea's Kirovsky neighborhood was rocked by an explosion as a train traveled along a line between Vladislavovka and Kirovskaya. As a result of the damage to the rails, Sergei Aksyonov, the governor of the annexed Crimea who was selected by the Kremlin, said that all train service had been suspended. A freight train was passing through the region at the time of the explosion, which occurred around 4 in the afternoon. The early examination indicates that the railway line's infrastructure has been severely damaged. The supply roads heading to Crimea have been damaged as a result of Ukrainian attacks and acts of sabotage. In contrast to the weakened military capabilities of the Russian Federation, Ukrainian soldiers are ready to march onto the peninsula. It's realistic to believe that Russia lacks the resources to mount a defense of Crimea against an attack by the Ukrainian army, which has the support of the United States and other NATO countries. Not only did this incident free Crimea from Russian invasion for good, but it also set a major historical precedent for the entire world. Regaining power in Crimea is critical for a number of reasons, not the least of which is preventing a return to a period of conquest. In spite of the difficulty involved, Ukraine now has the means to retake Crimea. Kiev intends to exhaust Moscow's units to inflict maximum damage on the Russian defensive forces with the help of newly created heavy armor from NATO and warriors trained by new extraterrestrials. However, there are only 55,000 Russian soldiers defending Crimea, so the Ukraine will require at least 150,000 men to launch an attack. He must make his way between Melitopol and Mariupol and destroy the Kerch Bridge again to cut off all Russian supply routes before we continue with our veto. I would like to remind you once more that if you are against the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work that we do with my team, you can like our video, comment, and hit the super thanks button. Even though Russia is taking precautions and measures against the great ethnic lounge that Ukraine has created. If you do this, you will show your support for the work that we do with my team. It is unclear how effective it will be against the Ukrainian army, which has been fortified with help from the West and the United States. On the other hand, since Russia's total takeover of Ukraine during the conflict that is currently going on, the Crimean Peninsula has become a site where Russia has taken significant damage. Taking into account the reports of attacks on Russian military posts, assassinations, and other targets in Crimea, we can declare that while Ukraine condemns all of these attacks and welcomes such occurrences, it also rejects all of these acts and condemns them. These events in Crimea and other regions of Russia, distant from the front lines of the war, showed severe weaknesses in Russia's defense and embarrassed Russian President Vladimir Putin, who was said to expect the intervention would be quick and easy. The events in Crimea and other parts of Russia are far from the front lines of the conflict. Liberation of all occupied regions, including Crimea, is one of the aims that Ukrainian commander Volodymyr Zelensky establishes as his mission. Along these lines, the Russian army is continuing to bolster its presence in the region for the possibility of an attack on Crimea being launched by Ukraine as part of the offensive for Russian President Vladimir Putin. The situation in Crimea is a touchy subject. If Russia were to lose Crimea, it would also lose access to the Mediterranean road as well as the Sea of Azov. Now, Putin is experiencing this at the highest level due to the fact that the Ukrainian army has scored many successes since the beginning of the war. Additionally, in the event that the land routes leading from Donbass to Crimea are severed, it is probable that the Russians will no longer be able to construct a logistic route by traveling by sea and air. After all, Crimea is a length that can be easily defended, but at the same time receiving assistance from the army that is guarding it can be just as challenging. But Kiev remains committed to achieving its objective of liberating the peninsula, in spite of Russia's threats to escalate the battle for Ukraine's independence. First, a surge in morale among the Ukrainian armed forces followed, and then a series of effective defensive tactics followed. At this point in the conflict, additional actions are required to be taken as things are not proceeding in the manner that Russia desired for them to progress in this direction. Ukraine launches daily attacks against strategic points in Crimea, and Kiev has stated that it plans to keep doing so until Crimea is freed. In addition, a strategy has been devised that will allow Ukraine to wrestle control of Crimea back from Vladimir Putin. To begin, there are locations within the points that need to be targeted where weapons are stored, as well as lines of supply that need to be cut. In fact, the infrastructure of communications, critical headquarters, and political decision centers will be the targets of the attack. On the other side, the Russian authorities who are occupying Crimea are forcing people to sell their homes and move their families out of the region. It has come to our attention that the Russian command and Moscow's deputies that have been installed in Crimea have started to withdraw from the annexed peninsula, selling their real estate and taking their families with them. It is asserted that the inhabitants of Crimea heard an announcement on radio stations the day before, instructing them to be ready to leave Crimea, and that the warning was directed at those who collaborated with a Russian occupying authority. Because of this, all people employed by Russia have been instructed to evacuate the Crimea region of Ukraine as quickly as they can. In other words, we can draw the conclusion from this pattern that the armed forces of Ukraine are responsible for creating panic and the dread of the possibility that it will be able to free Crimea in the not-too-distant future. As you may remember, President Zelensky of Ukraine has stated that there will be no peace without the liberation of Crimea, which is something that he has stated numerous times in the past. Now he continues to uphold his end of the bargain in this manner by keeping his word. We may argue that Ukraine is inching closer and closer to Crimea with each passing day. Kiev will not stop fighting until it has retaken control of Crimea. Crimea will serve as the front line of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and its outcome will be decided there. Since August, the Ukrainian army has been successful in regaining more than half of the land that was taken by Russia, which has frustrated the hopes of victory held by the Russian government. The Russian army, which was losing power hour by hour, lost the lenses it captured one by one, and ultimately experienced a level of defeat that had never been seen before in its whole history. Since Crimea has chosen to stand by our side during this testing period, we are now in a position to say that it is their turn.